In the last 3 lectures, we took a look at how to register and authenticate users manually. We took care of submitting and processing the request. We also took care of error handling and redirecting the user if the authentication was a success. In this lecture, we're going to take a look at an alternative method for authenticating the user. Previously, we only used the functions WordPress provides to handle the login. However, WordPress provides a couple of files for handling the logic for us. This process is a bit more limited and harder, but we get the advantage of letting WordPress handle the logic for us. The original WordPress login page can be used to authenticate the users. We can hook into this system and use it to our advantage. So let's get started. The very first thing we need to do is create the shortcode. Inside the main plugin file, under the shortcodes section, add a new shortcode and call it recipe auth alt form. The function to call will be our recipe auth alt form shortcode. After defining the shortcode, let's define the function that will contain our shortcode logic. Inside the includes/shortcodes folder, create a file named auth-form-alt.php. Define the function here and include it from the main plugin file. Let's add this shortcode to the My Account page. We previously named it recipe auth alt form, so input that into the shortcode block and update your changes. Once that's been inputted, log out and then navigate to the My Account page. I'm going to place the shortcode right below the form so we can do some comparisons. Back inside my editor, I'm going to copy the code from the original authentication shortcode into the new one. Then I'm going to get rid of most of this code except the conditional statement at top and the return statement. WordPress provides a function for generating a login form. It integrates really well with WordPress's login system. However, it is not formatted, so we'll have to take care of that quickly. I'm going to set the form HTML variable to div class equals call1 third no bottom margin. Then I'm going to close the div tag right before the return statement. We'll be placing most of our code between these two tags. The function that WordPress provides for generating a login form is WP login form. I'm going to append this function onto the form HTML variable. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to this function. This function only has one parameter, and that's an array of settings we can pass in to change the output of the form. One thing I do want to highlight is that while there are quite a few parameters here, the login form is not that flexible. WordPress doesn't really provide a way to add classes or change the HTML. We'll just work with what we have. Back inside the editor, I'm going to pass in an array. There are only two keys I want to set. The first key is the echo key. Since this is a shortcode, we have to return the HTML. The WP login form function will output the form by default. In order to make it return the HTML, we have to set this key to false. The next key I want to set is the redirect key. By default, WordPress will automatically redirect the user to the page where the form was submitted. It doesn't really make much sense to redirect the user back to the login page if they've successfully logged in. I'm going to set this to the home URL function, and I'll simply pass in a / to indicate I want the user to land on the root URL. With all that set, let's refresh the page and see what we get. WordPress generates this form for us, which doesn't really look appealing. Like I said before, the function we're using doesn't allow us to customize the HTML and classes being used. The reason we use it is because it'll generate all the input fields required for this form to work with the WordPress login flow. Alternatively, you could just copy and paste the HTML into your shortcode and just modify it from there. For this course, I'm just going to apply some styles to the HTML generated. Inside the /assets/css folder, you'll find a file called auth.css. I want you to register and enqueue this style sheet from the front enqueue function. I'm going to do this really quickly. Alright, I just registered and enqueued this file. All I'm really doing is stretching the width so that it doesn't look so out of place. Refresh the page and you should see form look more formatted and improved. You can leave it like this as we don't really need to do anything else. WordPress will now handle authenticating the user and providing errors. There is one problem I have with this form though besides the styling. I'm going to empty out these fields and then submit the form. After submitting the form, you should see an error message. However, I'm not redirected to the My Account page. Instead, we end up on the default WordPress login page. The point of having a front-end form is so that the user doesn't have to see this. We'll have to slightly modify the way the authentication behaves in order to make the submission redirect back to the My Account page if it was a failure. Just to save some time, I'm going to paste the code inside the main plugin file. I'm inside the main plugin file and I added in two hooks here which are both the same. These hooks are actual hooks WordPress registers. The reason I'm adding them here is just for example purposes. So the name of the hook is Authenticate. You use this hook to check the user data. WordPress will register two different functions here. What's most important here is the priority. What we want to do is change the way the authentication behaves while still letting WordPress do the heavy lifting. I want my function to run after WordPress has finished processing everything and is about to redirect the user. I want my priority to be a higher number than these two so my function gets executed last. I'm pasting in these two hooks to show you their priority. After these two hooks, WordPress will have already executed everything, and we can then take over. I'm going to comment these two out since WordPress already registers these two hooks. Doing it ourselves would be redundant. Below this, I'm going to add a filter hook using the same authenticate hook as above. The function I want to call will be called r-alt-authenticate. Then we must set the priority. By default, this will be 10, but I want this to be higher than the ones WordPress registers. Therefore, I'm going to set this to 100. You will also be provided with 3 values to use in the function. I'm going to set the fourth parameter to 3 so we can accept all 3 values in our function. Just to save some time, I'm going to define this function inside the shortcode file at the bottom like so. The 3 parameters that are accepted are the user, username, and password. Inside this function, I'm going to create a conditional statement that will check if the request method of the server variable is not set to post. If this condition passes, I'm just going to return the user. I don't want to redirect the user if the method is not post. Post is usually the method that's used when processing login data. Next, I'm going to create another conditional statement to check if the user object has errors by passing it into the function isWpError. If this returns false, I'm going to once again return the user object. If this ends up happening, then that usually means the user was successfully authenticated and so there's no need to redirect them back to the login page. If the function has made it this far, then that means the login submission has failed. I'm going to create a variable named error codes and set its value to the function getErrorCodes from the user object. This function will return an array of error codes. I want to pass the error codes back to my form so that we can display the errors to the user. However, we can't really pass an array back to the user, so we'll need to convert this to a string. I'm going to wrap this with a function called join, which will convert an array to a string. The first parameter to this function is the separator, which will just be a comma. The second parameter is the array itself. Now that we have the error codes in string form, we'll have to append it to the URL itself that we want to redirect the user to. I'm going to create a variable named loginURL and set its value to the home URL function and pass in the string my-account. We are manually setting the page here. Usually you want this to be dynamic, but we'll keep things simple here for now. This is just an alternative example to the original authentication method we did. Anyway, I'm then going to reassign this variable to the function addQueryArg. This is a function provided by WordPress that basically accepts a URL and will add a query to the URL for you. It will take care of making sure the URL is safe and ready to be used. There's 3 parameters for this function. The first parameter is the name of the query, which will be login. You can name this whatever you want, but login tends to be a common naming convention. The second parameter is the value for this query, which will be the error codes. Lastly, you just pass in the URL, which would be login URL. Now we have a full URL with the error codes. You'll see what the error codes look like in just a moment. The last step is to call the WP redirect function and pass in the URL. This function will redirect the user to the My Account page. Just as an extra measure, I'm going to kill the script with the exit statement. That should finish up our function. Let's refresh the page and try submitting the form with no input whatsoever. You should be redirected back to the page like I have. If you look at the URL bar, you'll see the error codes appearing. Each error code is separated with a comma, which is great. Back inside the shortcode function, we can grab the error codes by creating a variable named errors and set it to the get variable. By default, the error codes will not appear, so we'll use a ternary operator here. I'm going to check if the get variable is set. If it is, I'm going to set it to this variable. If not, I'm going to set it to an array. Of course, the get variable is a string, so we'll need to convert it into an array. I'm going to use the function explode to convert it from a string to an array. The first parameter is the separator, which is a comma, and the second parameter is the string itself. Just like that, we now have our error codes. I'm going to paste in some code here, which I'll go over. Alright, so all I have here is a loop going through each error in the array. There are 4 possible error codes, which are empty username, empty password, invalid username, and incorrect password. I'm adding some messages to the form element and displaying a user-friendly message to the user. Nothing too crazy here. Alright, let's refresh the page and you should see the 2 errors appearing here. I'm going to submit the form again, but this time with correct credentials. You should be logged in and redirected to the home page if it was successful. This is exactly what we wanted. So that concludes how you would authenticate a user. I've shown you 2 ways on how to do this, and either one is a valid solution. Some developers tend to think that they have to extend everything, but that's simply not true. You can take advantage of WordPress's core behavior and just tweak some things internally using hooks. At the end of the day, it's all preference. I'm going to comment out this second solution. I usually don't recommend it because at any point WordPress could change this behavior. There's also a lot of plugins that alter the way WordPress logs users in. It tends to be a pain to deal with. Now you may be wondering, but what about user registration? Unfortunately, WordPress doesn't provide any functions for creating a register form. This means you'll have to create it manually and hook it into the regular WordPress registration system. We won't be doing that in this course as it tends to be a long and hard process, making it not worth it. However, you're free to check it out yourself. All login and registration is handled inside the wp-login.php file. Anyway, I'll see you in the next lecture.